As someone who was once a slacker student frequently kept after school to copy assignments, I decided to repay my alma mater for nurturing me by staying on as a teacher after graduation. During staff meetings, I habitually snuck to the back row. Principal H, fuming with rage, glared at me and barked, "Sincere, stand up! You're a teacher now, not a student. Sit in the front." I rolled my eyes but complied. Still, no matter how hard I tried to stay alert, 2 minutes into the meeting, I was already fighting off sleep, just as my eyelids began to droop and I almost laid my head on the person next to me. A soft voice stirred me. "Stay awake. You can sleep later." Later, a student of mine remarked, "Cinny, I get it. Sitting in the back row with a female teacher is a clever way to avoid being noticed." I was speechless. At one of the routine faculty meetings, teachers filed into the conference room. Without a second thought, I made my way to the back. Principal H shouted, "Sincere, sit in the front." Begrudgingly, I moved forward, internally sighing. Even after all these years, I still couldn't escape Howie's control. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone next to me. Whose legs were those? So long, so fair, and was that perfume? Usually teachers turn into frumpy moms after a while, but this was different. I turned my head, and my gaze landed on a delicate, youthful face. For a moment I was stunned, my mind racing to recall if we ever had such a young and beautiful teacher here before. She noticed me staring, smiled softly, and gave a small nod. She seemed gentle and serene. Just as I was about to strike up a conversation, Howard coughed loudly and conspicuously. His stare was sharp, like a warning. "Focus on the meeting," his eyes seemed to say. I straightened up, sighed, and massaged my temples as I listened to Howard ramble on. Halfway through the meeting, I was on the verge of dozing off again. Just as my eyes began to flutter shut, that same gentle voice whispered beside me, "Stay awake, you can sleep later. Principal H is watching you." Startled, I glanced up at Howard, and sure enough, he was glaring at me with a look that promised trouble. Howard sneered, "Mr. Sincere, why don't you repeat what I just said?" I froze. Awkwardly, I tugged at the corner of my mouth, feeling utterly defeated. Turns out, even as a teacher, I couldn't escape the fate of being called on to answer questions. I hesitated before stammering, Mr. Liu's class gets the class flag again?" Howard's expression darkened. "No? Then, Mr. Zhangis on the list of excellent teachers?" Still wrong. The cafeteria is introducing a new menu." Howard's face twitched, his expression growing stormier by the second. Finally, I blurted out, Okay, it's a warning for Mr. Sincere's attendance penalty." Howard's mustache bristled with fury. He growled through gritted teeth, "You still have the nerve to say that? Sit down and copy the meeting minutes 10 times for me." I muttered under my breath, "Not again," and faintly heard a soft chuckle beside me. Howard snorted before continuing, "Let me repeat. Mrs. Wang from 11th grade class 6 is on maternity leave. This semester, Victoria will be taking over her language class." He turned to look at me, an odd glint in his eyes. Tilting his chin upward, he drawled, "As for the role of homeroom teacher for class 6, that will be filled by Mr. Sincere." Snapped out of my gloom, I stared at him dumbfounded. "Wait, what?" Howard cast me a smug glance, his tone tinged with pride. "Victoria is a renowned author and a graduate of Harvard's literature program. If it weren't for her desire to gain inspiration from campus life, there's no way we could have convinced her to join us. Mr. Sincere, with such support from the school, shouldn't you lead your students to some achievements?" I nodded, watching as he beamed and walked over to the stunning teacher beside me. "Victoria, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?" I smirked. So it was her. Victoria stood up, her graceful face lighting up with a warm smile. "Principal H flatters me. I'm still very inexperienced, and I look forward to learning from all of you." Some of the more seasoned teachers who had been through the ringer with rebellious kids sighed at her modesty while casting wistful gazes at her impeccable makeup and outfit. When the meeting ended, Howard tasked me with showing Victoria around the campus. As we strolled through the school grounds, we attracted plenty of attention. As we wandered onto the sports field, surrounded by curious stares from students, I remarked, "Miss Victoria, I think your teaching career might hit a snag soon." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, why's that?" I smiled faintly and teased, "If I had such a beautiful language teacher like you in high school, I'd have spent every class just admiring your face. Who could focus on studying?" I added, "By the way, you probably don't know this, but my high school language teacher and homeroom teacher was Howard himself." She lowered her gaze, chuckling softly. "Oh, I know." Before I could process her words, an excited voice interrupted my thoughts. "Cinny." I turned to see two of my Class 6 students, Dustin and Wayne. Their eyes darted between me and Victoria, their expressions growing increasingly mischievous. Exchanging a glance, they grinned at me and said, "Cinny, don't mind us. We'll just head back to class now." "Hey, wait, you two," I started, but they scurried off before I could finish. Shaking my head, I muttered, "Little brats." Turning to Victoria, I explained, "Those two are from Class 6. The usually rowdy ones you'll see soon enough. Let's walk around a bit longer, and then I'll take you to the classroom to meet them." It didn't take long for me to understand the meaning of those mischievous expressions. Victoria and I were standing silently at the door of Class 6, exchanging glances. Inside, Dustin was still talking. "I'm not lying, guys. Cinny really has a girlfriend. Wayne and I just ran into them on the track." He paused, as if recalling the scene, his voice tinged with awe. "You wouldn't believe it. She's gorgeous. No wonder Cinny fell head over heels for her. Wayne, don't you agree? Seriously, who could resist someone like that?" I was speechless. No words could describe my feelings. I glanced at Victoria. She pressed her lips together, her face expressionless, but her cheeks betrayed her with a faint blush. Inside, Wayne quickly chimed in, "It's true. We bumped into them head on. You wouldn't believe the way Cinny looked at her, all lovey-dovey and inseparable. Dustin and I were practically in front of them, and Cinny didn't even notice us." "Here, let us reenact it for you," Wayne said, grabbing Dustin and gazing down at him. That wasn't just lovey-dovey eyes. It was full-on infatuation. Dustin looked up at Wayne, his gaze lingering. I was speechless. Victoria was speechless. I rubbed my temples and said resignedly, "These two troublemakers are just messing around. Don't take it seriously, Vicky." I walked up to the pair with a grin. "Why don't you two kiss while you're at it?" Dustin lowered his head shyly and replied, "Oh, stop it." Wayne's grin slowly widened until he realized something was off. He stiffened, turned to look at me, and exclaimed, "Cinny." Dustin also froze, sneaking a guilty glance at me before dropping his head like a scolded child. I sneered, "Acting like clowns all day. I'll deal with you both later. For now, get back to your seats." Once the chaotic classroom settled down, I cleared my throat and said, "I have an announcement to make." As expected, my suspicions were confirmed. The students were unusually enthusiastic about the new teacher. Honestly, it wasn't hard to understand. Who wouldn't be excited if their English teacher looked like Victoria? Compared to the other stern female teachers at school, she was practically a breath of fresh air. On my first day as acting homeroom teacher, I quickly mastered the art of subtle observation. To test how attentive the students were in Victoria's class, I decided to conduct a surprise inspection. Quietly, I snuck to the back door of the classroom and peeked inside with my hands behind my back, trying to spot any troublemakers slacking off. Scanning the room, my eyes met Victoria's just as she turned around after finishing some notes on the board. She froze for a moment, the chalk in her hand pausing mid-air. I quickly brought a finger to my lips, signaling her to keep quiet. She glanced at me, then continued teaching as if nothing had happened. But was it just my imagination, or did she smile faintly as she turned away? The students, surprisingly, were on their best behavior. Pleased, I took out my phone and snapped a few photos of the class. As I reviewed the pictures, I couldn't help but marvel at how photogenic everyone looked. With just a few clicks, these could easily be used as promotional images for the school. When Victoria glanced at me again, I smiled and nodded at her before sending the photos to the parents' group chat. I mouthed to her, "You're so photogenic, Vicky." Her reaction was priceless. She froze for a moment, then turned back to the board with an air of calm. But from my angle, the faint blush on her cheeks was undeniable. I couldn't help but think to myself, Victoria seems surprisingly easy to tease. What I didn't anticipate was the storm those photos would stir up in the parents' group chat. The reason? Simple. Victoria's appearance. Some parents couldn't help but comment on how her beauty made them uneasy, while others accused me of staging the photos to make the students look good. They were aware that Mrs. Wang was on maternity leave and that the school had hired a new teacher, but they hadn't expected someone so young and attractive. One parent even demanded the school replace her, claiming she wasn't fit for the role. Reading their unfriendly comments, my anger flared. "One of yours?" "Absolutely," I affirmed. "So you're not upset or worried?" Victoria blinked calmly. "How they think is their business. As for whether I'm up to the task, I only care about you." Victoria paused, her beautiful eyes curving slightly as she spoke softly. "As long as you trust me, Mr. Sincere, that's enough." 3 weeks later, the sophomore class held their monthly exams. When the results came out, I had mixed feelings. On the bright side, Class 6 showed overall improvement in their English scores, particularly among students who were previously struggling. However, the physics results were far from satisfactory. I was disappointed because physics was my subject, and it hurt even more knowing that every other subject in Class 6 had shown some progress. It felt like I was the only one failing in this world. This frustration made me snap when the students suggested watching a movie in class to relax. Without a second thought, I shut them down. "You've got some nerve bringing that up," I snapped. "After performing that poorly in physics, do you think you deserve it?" No discussion. Wayne, with his neck stiffened in defiance, argued back, "Come on, Cinny. The other class gets to watch movies, why can't we? Aren't we your loyal crew anymore?" I gave him a sharp, resigned look. The other class performed better. Dustin, his face turning red, chimed in accusingly, "But we improved in everything except physics. Just because you got rained on doesn't mean you should tear our umbrella apart." A chorus of voices from the class erupted in agreement. "Yeah, exactly." I was speechless. No, I was beyond speechless. My already sour mood turned worse. Did they really have to twist the knife like this? I let out a cold laugh. Tearing it apart, so what, don't like it? Too bad. I'm the homeroom teacher, and that means I get the final say. End of discussion. Fuming, I stormed back to my office. But as I calmed down a bit, I started to feel like I might have overreacted. "Is everything okay, Mr. Sincere?" I looked up to find Victoria's gentle face gazing at me. I shrugged. "Not much. Just those little troublemakers getting on my nerves." As soon as I finished speaking, there was a knock on the office door. It was Dustin and Wayne. They approached me hesitantly, stealing glances at me as if they were testing the waters. "Mr. Sincere," Wayne began timidly, "we'd really like to ask for another chance." I rubbed my temples and gave a light cough, unable to turn them down completely. Wayne quickly added, "We've talked to everyone, and the class promises to study hard for the next physics test after watching the movie. We'll learn like our lives depend on it. Please just say yes." Though I was already softening inside, I maintained a cold, indifferent expression. Anyone can make empty promises. Dustin pouted in frustration, but then seemed to have an idea. His eyes lit up as he turned to Victoria, who had been quietly observing from the side. "Vicky, we made significant improvements in English this time. Don't you think we deserve a little break to watch a movie? Mr. Sincere listens to you the most. Can't you help us out?" Caught off guard, Victoria nodded slightly, her lips curving in thought. I suppose it wouldn't hurt. I stared at her, puzzled. Really? Sensing an opening, Dustin pressed on. "See, Cinny, even Vicky thinks it's okay. You should agree too." I let out another cold laugh. "Fine, but you'd better stick to what you said. Study like your lives depend on it after the movie. Dustin clapped his hands in excitement. That's a yes, I knew you were the best, Cinny. Wayne grinned from ear to ear, his tone overly ingratiating. Then tonight, when we watch the movie, Mr. Sincere and Vicky should join us too. I waved them off, amused. All right, enough. Get out. The two of them left the office, practically dragging each other out in their excitement. Before they were even out the door, I heard them whispering, Wow, Cinny is so protective of Vicky. I'm shipping them so hard right now. Totally. Next time, let's just ask Vicky directly. I was at a loss for words. Amused and exasperated at the same time, I glanced at Victoria. Those two. I wanted to explain that they were just being silly, but I noticed Victoria lowering her gaze, her long lashes trembling slightly. From my angle, I could see a faint blush rising on her fair cheeks. I swallowed my unfinished sentence, suddenly feeling mischievous. They're not wrong, I said, meeting her warm eyes. Didn't I tell you? You're one of us in Class 6. Pampering you is my duty. I paused, suppressing a grin, and added seriously, It's only fair. That evening, when Victoria and I entered the classroom, the students had already turned off all the lights and drawn the curtains tightly. The only light came from the projector screen at the front. To their credit, they had nailed the movie-watching ambiance. Their desks were littered with snacks and drinks, and the faint aroma of chips and soda filled the air. The movie hadn't started yet. They were waiting for us. Dozens of eyes turned to focus on us, their faces illuminated by the screen's glow, their eyes sparkling with anticipation. I couldn't help but laugh. All right, stop stalling and start the movie already. I can't wait. I led Victoria to the back of the classroom, where Dustin and Wayne waved us over enthusiastically. Cinny, over here, Dustin called. As we approached, I glanced around and frowned. Where are our seats? Dustin grinned cheekily. You and Vicky can have ours. Wayne explained, Yeah, these seats have the best view. He paused, his eyes darting between me and Victoria, a mischievous glint in his gaze. Also, it's perfect for, not being noticed if you do anything. I was speechless again. Their seats were in the last row, right by the back door. With the door shut, it was indeed an ideal spot for less than innocent activities. To be honest, it was my favorite spot as a student. Victoria arched her brows slightly and said softly, You two should give us your seats. Where will you sit? Wayne chuckled and pointed to the side, saying, No problem. I got another chair. I frowned and asked, Just one? Blushing, Dustin replied, There's only one extra chair, but it's fine. I can sit on Wayne's lap. Ah, the passionate antics of teenagers. I was at a loss for words and said, As long as you're happy. Victoria sighed lightly and said, Sorry to trouble you. The movie we chose was a comedy packed with laughs and devoid of awkward moments. The classroom echoed with laughter throughout. I chuckled and said, Vicky, this punchline is how can it be so absurd and hilarious every single time? I turned my head, and as I met Victoria's gaze, my voice abruptly stopped amid the laughter. She was quietly looking at me. In her eyes, there was not only warmth but also an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I didn't know how long she had been looking at me. Suddenly, I felt a bit flustered. Awkwardly, I asked, Isn't it funny? The corners of Victoria's lips curved gently as she said softly, No, it's very funny. I was speechless. Look at yourself. Do you really seem like you're finding it funny? In a gentle voice, Victoria replied, It's just that a scene I could only imagine in dreams before has suddenly come true. It feels a bit unreal. The classroom erupted in another wave of laughter. I didn't catch what she said clearly, so I leaned closer and asked, What did you just say? Speak up. Victoria met my gaze, her beautiful eyes curving slightly. She said, Sincere, I'm really happy. She looked up at me, her smile radiant and her expression serene. In that moment, I felt my heart racing out of control. Two inappropriate voices suddenly broke in. Why aren't they kissing yet? It's gotta be soon, right? Look at their eyes. Practically sparking. I turned to face Dustin and Wayne, who were sitting about 6 feet away, their gazes fervent and impatient. When they caught me looking, they quickly averted their eyes. Wayne feigned annoyance and said, "You're crushing my legs, you pig." Unwilling to back down, Dustin retorted, "Weakling, you're just frail. Fine, switch with me, I'll let you sit on my lap." I was speechless. Victoria was speechless. The parents' group chat was in chaos again. This time, the target of their complaints was me. One parent took the lead, criticizing me for showing a movie to the students. Coincidentally, the most vocal critic was the same person who had previously attacked Victoria. This time, she accused me of being an incompetent physics teacher who neglected my duties and wasted students' time, threatening to report me to the school for dereliction of duty. In the office, I couldn't stop sighing. Being a homeroom teacher is no easy job. I wasn't exactly angry, after all, I'm pretty easygoing, but I did dread the hassle. If this escalated, Howard would surely call me into his office for tea. Pure nightmare. Howard could talk endlessly for 1 or 2 hours straight. My face was clouded with worry, and naturally Victoria noticed. She was in the parents' group chat as well, so she had witnessed the entire ordeal. Her expression didn't look much better than mine. She frowned slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Touched, I figured she must be feeling bad for her colleague's predicament, so I ended up comforting her instead. "Vicky, don't worry about me. Worst case, Howie will call me in for a lecture." I sighed deeply, my tone weary. "I know the drill, it's been the same throughout high school. At worst, I'll just have to." I paused, my voice tinged with bitterness. "Write the teacher's manual 10 times over." Victoria froze for a moment, then smiled, her brows relaxing. "That won't happen." Her bright eyes regained their usual sparkle as she looked at me. "I'll talk to him." I grumbled in frustration. "That old crank. He's all smiles when he talks to you, but when it's me, he treats me like his personal whipping boy. It's been almost a month since I last got called into his office. He's probably itching for a reason to let loose. No way he's letting this chance slide." Resigned, I sighed. What's coming will come. Victoria looked up at me, her smile gentle and stunning. "Don't worry, I'll have a good talk with him, after all." She arched her brows, her voice soft and sweet. "He's my uncle." I was dumbfounded. I tugged at the corner of my mouth and stammered, "Howard is your uncle? How come I never knew?" Victoria blinked innocently. "Well, Mr. Sincere, you never asked me." I suddenly recalled the things I had just said about Howard being an old crank in front of her. I was speechless. After a few seconds of silence, I said, Yeah, about that. I was just joking earlier, spur of the moment, you know." I paused, then continued with a straight face. "Actually, in my eyes, Principal H is highly esteemed, tirelessly dedicated, approachable, kind, incredibly wise, selflessly devoted, and still full of vigor despite his age." I stole a glance at Victoria, cleared my throat, and added, "And you, Vicky, are equally remarkable. Not only are you knowledgeable and cultured, but also graceful, poised, and elegant." I got more and more carried away as I spoke. Sneaking another peek at Victoria, I saw her resting her chin on her hand, smiling at me with amusement in her eyes. I trailed off, my voice lowering to a slightly fawning tone. With a sheepish smile, I said, "Vicky, please don't sell me out to Howard." Victoria let out a soft laugh, her delicate features brightening with her warm smile. The corners of her eyes and brows were adorned with a radiant smile so stunning it struck right at the heart. She said, "Cindy, you're so eloquent. I barely have enough time to praise you. How could I ever say anything bad about you?" Then she pressed her lips together gently. Though her lips still held a smile, her eyes carried an almost imperceptible tinge of sorrow. She said sadly, "Such a wonderful teacher like you. Cindy, how could they misunderstand and wrong you like this?" I couldn't quite tell if I was moved or felt something else entirely, but my chest swelled with emotion, a restless heat rising within me. Gathering myself, I looked at her stunningly beautiful face and replied nonchalantly, "Victoria, you're so concerned about me I don't even know how to respond. Maybe I should just die to prove my gratitude, huh?" Ha ha ha. Victoria met my gaze directly, her clear and pleasant voice carrying a hint of amusement. She said, "It's obvious, Cinny. After all." She paused, raised her eyes to lock onto mine, and her lips curved into a faint smile. Her gaze was magnetic, almost entrancing. "You're one of us. Of course, it's only natural for me to care about you." Her smile threw me off balance for a moment, and it was only after a delay that I realized I'd been outmaneuvered. Uh-oh, Vicky has definitely learned some tricks. Before I could respond further, Howard called me into his office, where Victoria was already waiting. Inside, I absent-mindedly listened to Howard's lectures, my gaze drifting between him and Victoria. How could this old man have such a stunning niece? Howard snapped, "Sincere, are you even listening to me?" Snapping back to attention, I composed myself and replied evenly, "You said a parent has called to complain and wants me removed as the homeroom teacher." Howard snorted angrily. "And do you think you did anything wrong?" I nodded calmly. "Absolutely. A huge mistake." I sighed, a trace of regret crossing my face. If I'd known this would happen, I would have called her kid into the office for a study session. He could study, and we could watch our movie. Howard was speechless. Then he let out a cold laugh, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "So many years have passed and you're still obsessed with watching movies, huh?" Without hesitation, I replied, "Stay true to your original passion and—" "Shut up," Howard said, his lips twitching in frustration. Victoria, who had been quietly observing our exchange, finally spoke. Her tone was calm but firm. "Howard, this is clearly just a parent being unreasonable. Cinny did nothing wrong." She smiled faintly, nodded earnestly, and added, "Honestly, with a parent like that, even giving them extra lessons wouldn't help. Plus, showing movies to students is a way to help them relax and balance work with leisure. Cinny did the right thing." Howard met Victoria's gaze and nodded. "You're right, Victoria. I thought so too. I've already communicated with that parent, so we'll consider the matter closed. I actually called you both here to discuss the upcoming parent-teacher conference next month after the exams. Cinny, you're a loose cannon. Make sure you don't end up arguing with the parents or, heaven forbid, fighting with them." I rolled my eyes and protested. "Prejudice. That's blatant prejudice. I've changed a lot. I'm now a mature, composed adult who doesn't let emotions show. There's no way I'd argue or fight with a parent." Howard shot me a skeptical look and drawled, "Mature and composed? You? Shall I list your offenses in front of Victoria?" Meeting Victoria's curious gaze, I quickly interjected, "No need for that, really." Howard smirked, clearly pleased with himself, and took a sip from his teacup, exhaling contentedly. "All right, you're dismissed. Go on." As I left, I couldn't help but ask, "By the way, are you really Victoria's uncle? Because honestly, it doesn't seem like it." Without waiting for his response, I shook my head and added, "I mean, if I'd had a gentle, caring, and sweet teacher like Victoria back in high school, there's no way my grades would have been so terrible." Victoria froze for a moment, her cheeks flushing red. Howard, on the other hand, was livid. "You little rascal, get out of here, now." A month later, the parent-teacher conference arrived as scheduled. True to Howard's prediction, I ended up in a heated argument with that unreasonable parent. In the hallway outside the classroom, the woman stormed towards me, accusing me of being the reason her child's grades had plummeted since I became their homeroom teacher. She claimed I was incompetent and unfit to be a teacher. At first, I tried reasoning with her, but her aggression only escalated. Eventually, she declared that people like me had no right to teach. That was the last straw. Keeping my tone steady, I replied, "Maybe you should look at yourself first. Perhaps it's your overbearing pressure that's causing your child's grades to drop." She froze for a moment, then raised her voice. "Are you saying I'm to blame? That I hand my child over to your school and you're blaming me for your failure to teach?" I smiled slightly and said, "Exactly. Let me make it clear. We teachers are here to teach. As long as a student isn't disrupting others, it's not our responsibility, nor our right, to interfere in their personal matters. Teachers and students are equals. I put in the effort to teach. Whether they learn or not is up to them. In any class, there will always be a range of abilities. Some students excel, and some don't. If your child's grades are dropping, maybe it's time to reflect on your own approach. She glared at me, clearly seething as I stood my ground. You're supposed to help him identify the reasons for his declining grades, not come here to blame me. I won't take responsibility for this. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. If you're still dissatisfied, feel free to file a complaint. I have no objections. I don't have the energy to argue with you. This is on the 6th floor of the administration building, room 608. If you have issues, take them to him. I have other matters to attend to. Excuse me. As I turned to leave, she suddenly glared at me and charged forward, yelling, "What the hell do you mean by that? Who do you think you are to talk to me like this? What kind of teacher are you?" She lifted her hand, aiming to slap me. I sidestepped her, anger flaring in my chest as I prepared to retaliate. But before I could act, someone grabbed my arm. I turned to see Victoria, who gave my arm a gentle tug, signaling me to stay calm. She stepped forward, her tone icy as she asked, "What do you think you're doing?" The woman froze, seemingly startled by Victoria's piercing glare. After a few seconds of silence, her eyes darted between us before she sneered, her voice sharp and mocking. A teacher, getting all handsy with a woman in front of students. What kind of example are you setting? How can someone like you call themselves a teacher? Victoria's usual sweet smile vanished. Rolling her eyes, she adopted an air of superiority. "Ma'am," she began, her voice calm but cutting. "If that's how you feel, may I ask you something? You're here, in front of all these students, insulting our teacher and even trying to hit him. Does that make you a qualified parent? Have you considered how this might affect your child's self-esteem?" Victoria paused, lowering her gaze as if in deep thought before adding, "And if you're so dissatisfied with the teachers at this school, perhaps you should consider transferring your child. I'd be more than happy to personally assist you with the paperwork. If we start the process now, he could be enrolled in a new school by the day after tomorrow. Of course, I can't guarantee that other schools won't hear about your behavior, but if no school accepts him, you can always come back here. Who knows? Maybe an apology will soften Mr. Sincere's heart and he'll forgive you." The woman stammered, "You," but her earlier bravado had vanished. She clenched her fists in frustration before muttering, "You're not the principal. I'm going to complain to him." I smiled and said, "Room 608 in the administration building. Don't get lost. Have a nice day." As the woman stormed off, I turned to meet Victoria's gaze, staring at her intently. She blushed under my scrutiny and asked, "What is it? Is there something on my face?" I shook my head, my expression serious. I just didn't realize Victoria had two sides to her, sweet and commanding. Who wouldn't be charmed by that? She froze for a moment, her cheeks growing even redder. I couldn't resist teasing her further. "Did you hear that, Victoria?" She looked at me, puzzled. "Hear what?" I placed a hand over my chest dramatically. My heart, it's practically leaping out of my chest. I paused before continuing. "You get what I mean, don't you?" Victoria's cheeks were still flushed, but she met my gaze without flinching. With a soft huff, she said, "You're such a smooth talker, Mr. Sincere. Enough joking around. Otherwise," she bit her lip lightly and added in a soft voice, "I might take you seriously." After that day, the dynamic between Victoria and me seemed to shift into something ambiguous. At least that's how I saw it. Even Dustin and Wayne noticed something was off and came to interrogate me. "Cinny, are you and Miss Victoria secretly dating?" Dustin asked bluntly. Before I could deny it, he cut me off, saying, "You must be. You don't joke around with her in front of us anymore, and you barely talk to her. This is what we call acting guilty." Wayne nodded in agreement. "Exactly. If there's nothing going on, why are you acting so weird?" The two of them exchanged knowing looks, throwing me a smug glance as they left. "It's confirmed. They're definitely dating in secret. Look at Cinny, too flustered to even defend himself." I stood there, utterly baffled. At least give me a chance to explain, I muttered to myself. Honestly, I was starting to panic. I'd always been carefree, never thinking twice before joking around. It never occurred to me that my half-serious remarks would make Victoria take me seriously. I was wrong. I regretted it. But now the problem was, I think I might also. Mr. Sincere, are you avoiding me? Her gentle voice broke my train of thought. I met her gaze, those beautiful eyes searching mine. I opened my mouth, then sighed. Of course not. Victoria lowered her eyes, a hint of sadness flashing across her face. If it's because of what I said that day, then. Her voice faltered. She looked down, her long lashes trembling as she added softly, just forget it. Pretend I never said anything. Her delicate features looked almost hurt, and I felt a pang of guilt. I tried to explain but couldn't find the words. It's not that, it's just… She interrupted me with a faint smile. I understand. Victoria's smile returned, as warm and graceful as ever. I have a class next. I'll head to the classroom now. I watched her tall figure walk away, pressing my fingers to my temples in frustration. The next day, Victoria didn't come to school. I spent the entire morning distracted, my mind elsewhere during class. Finally, I gave in and went to ask Howard about her. Howard told me that Victoria was sick and had taken a day off to rest at home. Sitting in the office, restless and uneasy for quite a while, I finally made up my mind. On behalf of the entire Class 6, I decided to visit Victoria personally. I said, here's the thing. Those little troublemakers in class heard you were ill and got worried. They insisted that I come and check on you. I paused, my gaze uncontrollably drifting elsewhere. Victoria was wearing a black silk nightgown, the top slightly unfastened, revealing a hint of pale skin. My eyes moved upward to her flushed face. She was clearly running a fever. I swallowed hard, my mind filled with thoughts I shouldn't be having. Victoria looked up at me, her gaze steady despite the fatigue. Her voice, hoarse from the illness, sounded softer than usual. Thank you, she said. She stepped aside to open the door and let out a weak cough. After a moment, she added in a low voice, come in. My chest tightened. I stepped inside and immediately guided Victoria back to her bedroom. Stop talking, I said. Go lie down and rest. She sighed, pouting a little. You came all the way here. I'm not going to rest. I'm fine. Sit for a bit while I prepare something to eat. I waved my hand dismissively and pressed her back down firmly. Listen to me. You lie down for now. I'll make you some porridge, I said, already helping her toward the bed. She tried to resist, but I underestimated how weak she was. Between the fever and not eating, her steps were unsteady. Before I knew it, she stumbled and fell right into my arms. We both tumbled onto the bed, and by the time I realized what had happened, her lips were already brushing the corner of mine. I froze. Quickly, I pushed myself off the bed. She looked flustered, her long lashes trembling and her ears turning bright red. After a moment, she whispered, just now, we. I forced myself to stay calm. We kissed, I said, but not really. It was just a little touch. Trying to ease her embarrassment, I added, just pretend it didn't happen. She pressed her lips together, as if wanting to say something, but before she could, she started coughing uncontrollably. Her discomfort made her eyes water, and the corners of her eyes turned red. Panicking, I patted her back and said, don't talk right now. Have you taken any medicine? Why is it this bad? After a moment, she looked up at me with a pitiful expression and said, are you going to deny it again? I was taken aback. She lowered her gaze, her pale face revealing her vulnerability. She said, it was the same last time. Her lashes quivered and her soft voice carried a trace of hurt. Sincere, don't play with my feelings anymore, okay? I was stunned for a long while before it hit me she cared this much. I sighed inwardly, resigning myself to the situation, seeing her lower her gaze, tears welling up at the corners of her eyes, her radiant face filled with sadness. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I pulled her into a hug. After all, with such a beauty in my arms, how could any normal man like me remain unaffected? She stiffened at my sudden action and said in a trembling voice, "What are you doing?" I replied seriously, "What playing around? I'm an honest man. Since we kissed, it's only right for me to take responsibility." I brushed her hair gently and added earnestly, "I feel like I've struck gold. A kind and lovely Victoria, and she's mine." Burying her face in my chest, she didn't say a word. Seeing her so endearing, I teased, "So overwhelmed you're speechless, huh?" After a long while, she murmured, "Dream come true. Can't hold it in anymore." Later, while strolling around the campus with Victoria, I asked her when she started liking me. Without hesitation, she hooked her arm around mine, her eyes brimming with emotion. "A long time ago," she said. "Long before you even noticed, I already liked you." I was about to ask more when two familiar voices came from behind. "Aha, caught you. Told you they were already dating." "Idiot, keep your voice down. Don't let them hear us." I sighed, exasperated. "Great, now those two brats saw us. It won't be long before everyone knows." Victoria smiled, her expression soft and radiant. "Exactly as planned," she said. Tightening her grip on my arm, she added with a playful glint in her eyes, "Sincere as mine. In the winter of my senior year, my parents' 20-something-year marriage finally fell apart. My mother, preoccupied with the mess of the divorce, had little time to care for me, so she entrusted me to my Uncle Howard. The first time I met Sincere was in Howard's office. It was a Friday, and I was working on some assignments while waiting for Howard to finish his work so we could leave together. Sincere was brought into the office by Howard. He'd gotten into trouble and Howard was scolding him. "So you were the one who hijacked the movie night in class last night, huh? And then used the dark to start a fight? Ended up with a black eye and a bloody nose. Was that you too? Do you feel unsettled unless you're causing trouble?" Sincere didn't seem to be paying attention. His gaze lingered on the office door and he muttered, "It's Friday, sir. School's out." He sniffed and sighed dramatically. "It's cold. I just want to go home and have some of my mom's hot chili soup." Howard, clearly used to his antics, didn't react. Keeping a stern face, he asked if Sincere knew what he'd done wrong. Sincere, looking deceptively obedient, nodded hastily and promised never to repeat his mistakes. When Howard finally waved him off, Sincere bolted for the door as if he couldn't wait to leave. Just as he reached the door, he turned back with a half-hearted, "See you, sir," and dashed out. With a bright smile, I said to Howard, "Mr. Howard, have a great weekend." At that time, I had only one thought. He was so intriguing. Unfortunately, his mind was entirely focused on getting home, and he didn't even notice me. The second time I saw him was also in the office. He had bombed the language arts exam that month and was ordered by Howard to stay behind and copy out the questions he had repeatedly gone over 10 times before he could leave. This time, he finally noticed me. While Howard stepped out to take a call from my mom, he took the opportunity to scoot closer and strike up a conversation. He was curious about who I was. He asked if I'd been held back to finish homework too, and what class I was in. Then, with a cheeky grin, he added that someone as good-looking as me couldn't possibly have escaped his notice before. I remember not being in the best mood at the time, so I was a bit curt with him, or maybe I didn't even respond. Years later, when we crossed paths again, the completely unfamiliar look in his eyes as he glanced at me left a bitter taste in my mouth. A liar, I thought. All those sweet words, and yet he forgot me. But I remembered. I always remembered. I remembered how that day ended. Once he finally finished copying the questions, he practically bolted out of the office like he'd been pardoned. Before leaving, he handed me a piece of candy. He said, "Being kept back by a teacher isn't such a big deal. It's just a special privilege because the teacher cares about you, so don't feel bad. Here, have some candy." Finally, he added, "Hey, have a great weekend." The day I learned my parents' divorce was finalized, I was once again in Howard's office finishing up some questions. My mom's text came through, and in that moment my hands and feet went cold. My face drained of color. How did I feel? I suppose it was the kind of sadness you can't hold back, even though you've known it was coming for a while. Howard was just coming in with Sincere, ready to launch into one of his lectures, but he didn't get the chance. My mom called and he had to step out again, leaving just me and Sincere in the office. Sincere recognized me and waved, saying, "Hey, it's you again." Then he noticed my trembling hands. Hesitantly, he asked, "Are you cold?" I steadied myself, about to say no, but before I could, he nodded to himself and said, "Yeah, it is pretty chilly today. Wait here." I watched in confusion as he turned his back to me. Then came the sound of a zipper, followed by a soft rip. When he turned back around, he was holding a heat patch in his hand. He offered it to me with a smile. "I just put it on this morning. It's clean. If you don't mind, take it." I accepted the patch and looked up to meet his smiling eyes. In that moment, warmth swept through me, and feelings I hadn't expected began to take root. Later, when my mom decided to transfer me to another city, my thoughts were consumed with him. I hadn't even had the chance to act on my feelings, and now I was being forced to leave. Still, I thought, I should at least tell him my name, right? Or maybe give him my contact information. I could even say my language arts grades were decent and that he could talk to me about studying. But the Friday before I left, I waited in Howard's office and didn't see him. That little troublemaker had been unusually well behaved that week, leaving Howard without a reason to scold him. Forget it, I told myself. It's just me being one-sided. Why bother trying to find him? But even so, I couldn't help feeling regret. He probably didn't even know my name. I forced myself to stop thinking about him, but I often couldn't help dreaming of him. In my dreams, we went to the same school, and he was my desk mate. His language arts grades were still terrible, but it didn't matter. I could teach him. In those dreams, he would still pester Howard to play movies. And then, in the dimly lit classroom, he'd sneakily hold my hand under the desk. But dreams always end. I woke up in a city far from him, fully aware that he wasn't part of my life anymore. I never expected to see him again. When I heard from Howard that one of his mischievous former students had come back to teach at the school, I instinctively thought of him. When I found out it was true, I immediately started planning to teach there as well. It just so happened that the language arts teacher for his class was going on maternity leave. Everything fell into place so easily that it felt like fate was giving us another chance. Even though that heartless little rascal had forgotten me, it didn't matter. Just being able to see him again was a blessing.